we did not choose the family or the house where we were born into. It would be nice if we could make the selection. And before we are born, just look at the world. I want to go in that family. I like those people. Most people would select a rich, influential family. Some others, smarter, would choose a good Christian family. Very few would select a poor, hard-working family. God, in His wisdom, did not give us that freedom of choice. We were born when and where God wanted us to be born. I used to think that I was born in the wrong country, in the wrong family, in the wrong language, and at the wrong time. I am a young soul, stuck in an old body, talking funny. But looking back, I know that I was born at the right time and at the right place. God does not make any mistakes. He guided me all along and all the way to where I am now, and I'm fine with it. This morning, we are going to see the story of a young man who was born in a rich, powerful family. His dad was a king, making him a prince. He was the firstborn, making him in line to be the next king. You cannot be that. You cannot be born in a better place than that. But as we take a look at his story, you will see that he was not that lucky. He was not that blessed after all. It is hard to succeed when you have a terrible, unreasonable father. This young man had an unreasonable dad. And because of the jealousy of his father, this young man lost three important things. He lost his best friend, he lost his freedom, and he even lost his life at a young age. Today we'll continue our journey to the characters of the Bible with the story of Jonathan, the son of King Saul. So please turn to our text, 1 Samuel chapter 13. We get the background of Jonathan in the genealogy of Benjamin in 1 Chronicles chapter 8. It says there in verse 33, Ner begot Kish, Kish begot Saul, and Saul begot Jonathan, Malchishua, Abinadab, and Eshbaal. The son of Jonathan was Merib-Baal. We know him as Mephibosheth. And Merib-Baal begot Micah. Jonathan's father was Saul. Saul had 4 sons mentioned here. Jonathan was the firstborn, the heir to the throne. His mom was Ahinoam. We do not know anything about her. We don't know where Saul met her, when they got married, how we have any detail about that. Jonathan only had 1 son named Mephibosheth, but he's also referred to as Merib-Baal, the nickname or people giving him name. And he was crippled. His nurse dropped him, and he became lame in both feet. That's in 2 Samuel chapter 4. He had a miserable life because of the mistake of another person. That is sad. So let's start the story of Jonathan. Verse 1, Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel. 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in the mountains of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. the rest of the people, he sent away every man to his tent. And Jonathan attacked the garrison of the Philistine that was in Geba, and the Philistine heard of it. Then Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." Now all Israel heard it said that Saul had attacked a garrison of the Philistine, and that Israel had also become an abomination to the Philistines. And the people were called together to Saul at Gilgal. When we meet this young man, Jonathan, he's already an adult. He is now fighting the Philistine with his dad, King Saul. We do not know his age. We do not know the name of his wife. He was married. We do not know anything about his early years, how he was raised. We know that his dad had a farm before he was a king. So most likely this young man grew up on the farm with his dad until all of a sudden his dad became king. What a change in the family. All we know from the book of Chronicles is that he was married and he had a son that was lame in both feet. The introduction of Jonathan here shows us right away the way he was. Contrary to his dad, Jonathan was a humble man. His dad took the credit for the attack made by Jonathan, his son, on the Philistines. All Israel were saying that Saul attacked the garrison of the Philistines. Jonathan did not say anything. He did not try to correct the information. "Oh no, it was me." He never did that. It is not easy to just stand there and let someone else take the credit for what you have accomplished. Jonathan did. Taking the glory for another man's work is a sign of pride. His father was a very prideful man. But remember what the Bible says, pride goes before the fall. And Saul really fell. In the rest of this chapter, we see the sinful sacrifice of his dad. Saul was an impatient man. And because Samuel was late to offer the burnt offering, that's the job of the priest, so he, the king, decided to offer it himself. Jonathan is witnessing all this. He set himself up as Samuel's equal. He did not obey Samuel's instruction to wait for him. Jonathan was there, listening to Samuel the prophet scolding his father. He heard Samuel say to his dad, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God." He's listening, the young kid. "Now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart." Wow. Not a good thing for a son to hear. We know that Jonathan was the heir to the throne. And I wonder if at that moment, deep inside, he got excited, thinking, maybe I am going to be appointed king soon. God has rejected my dad. But from the scriptures, we do not get that impression. Jonathan was not like this. He was a very humble man. He was not at all pompous. In verses 19 to 23 of this chapter 13, we are given a little insight on the condition and the weapons that the Jews had. There was no blacksmith to be found throughout Israel. The Philistines had made sure they had closed every shop. They had to go down to the Philistines to sharpen their tools. Nobody had any weapon, no sword, no spear, except two men, Saul and Jonathan, two swords in the country. Chapter 14 deals with Saul's selfish curse that almost cost Jonathan his life. We read that in verse 1. Now it happened one day that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young men who bore his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side." But he did not tell his father. And Saul was sitting in the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men. Ahiah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh, was wearing an ephod. But the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Between the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a sharp rock on one side, and the name of one was Bozez, and the name of the other was Sene. The front of one faced the northward opposite Michmash, and the other faced southward opposite Gibeah. Then Jonathan said to the young men who bore his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work with us. For nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few." So Jonathan, alone with his armor bearer, decided to go and attack a detachment of Philistines. They had established an outpost on the north side of a narrow mountain near Michmash. So he took his armor bearer with him and with his one sword, and they decided to go. Saul knew nothing about his son's plans. He was sitting with his 600 men near his own town of Gibeah. Now, look what Jonathan called them. He called them these uncircumcised. By calling them uncircumcised, Jonathan was reminding himself and reminding his armor bearer that these people were outside of God's covenant. God was not with them. They had no business, they had no right in being in Canaan. God had reserved that land for his people, Israel. Jonathan was demonstrating great faith. Why they're here? This is not their land. God has given us this land. We don't have weapons, but we have God. There is a similar story of faith later in 2 Chronicles chapter 14. It involved King Asa. He had an army of 580,000 men. But the Ethiopians were coming against him with an army of over 1 million Africans. Verse 11 says, and I read it, Asa cried out to the Lord his God and said, "Lord, it is nothing for you to help, whether with many or with those who have no power. Help us, O Lord, our God, for we rest on you, and in your name we go against this multitude. O Lord, you are our God. Do not let men prevail against you." What was the result? We read next verse. So the Lord struck the Ethiopians before Asa and Judah, and the Ethiopians fled. And Asa and the people who were with him pursued them to Gerar. So the Ethiopians were overthrown, and they could not recover, for they were broken before the Lord and his army. You cannot go wrong when you trust God. There is great power in walking by faith. Both Jonathan and this King Asa experienced victory by simply trusting in the Lord. This was not a brash stunt that Jonathan pulled. This was not a foolish suicide mission. Jonathan was looking to God to provide the victory, a great victory, because he's a great God. He does great things. It did not matter that there was only two of them. It did not matter that they had only one sword between the two guys. He knew the greatness of God. He knew that God can bring victory with many people or with few. When you serve a great God, expect great things. In verses 7 to 16, Jonathan sort of asked God for a sign or a fleece, like Gideon. He said to his guy, to his armor bearer, if they say, come up to us, that will be the sign that we should go up and attack them. Sure enough, the Philistine used the exact same keyword. Come on up to us, in verse 12. So Jonathan and his armor bearer climb up on their hands and knees, and they arrive at the top and they kill 20 men, verse 14. Then God himself became directly involved in a supernatural way. You trust God, God's going to show up. He caused an earthquake, a very great trembling in verse 15. And there was great panic among the Philistines. When you move by faith, expect God to be there. He will show up for you. In verses 17 to 23, Saul and his men pursued the confused Philistines. The Israelites who had been hiding in chapter 13 and others who had been living among the Philistines, they all quickly joined in the battle. So the Lord rescued Israel that day. It was indeed the Lord's victory. In verses 24 to 42, to guarantee success, Saul, excited, rashly forbade his soldiers under oath to eat anything until evening, until the battle was over. And he sealed his order with a curse. Curse is the one who will eat anything. Saul was trying to buy a favor from God with his forced fast. You cannot obtain favor from God by fasting. You can get closer to God by fasting, but you cannot. It has been still to this day the idea, I'm going to fast and I'm going to get something from God. No. Fasting is not to get a favor. Hunger causes men to become weary and weak and put them at a disadvantage. Now, not knowing about this, his father's decree, Jonathan ate some honey to regain his strength in verse 27. When he was told about the curse, oh, you should not eat, your father said, curses the men who eat, he mourned that Israel's triumph was hindered by such an unwise and senseless order. from his father. In verses 31 to 42, Saul's restriction not only angered Jonathan, it endangered the people as well. When the fighting was over, they rushed on the spoil. They killed some animals there, and they ate it without draining the blood. That was a violation against Leviticus 17 and Deuteronomy 12. The Jews were never to eat with the blood. They had to drain the blood from the animal completely before they could eat. But they did not. They were too hungry. Saul wanted to pursue the Philistine into the night. So he called the priest and he asked him to consult God. But God did not answer him. This led Saul to believe that there was sin in the camp. God is not answering me. There is sin in the camp. As was done in such cases, the lot was brought out, and to his surprise, Jonathan was taken. Verse 42. He was exposed as the guilty person. God did not try to hide the truth. He did not try to protect Jonathan from being found out. Jonathan was exposed, but he will be protected by God. The story goes on, verse 43. Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you have done." And Jonathan told him and said, "I only tasted a little honey with the end of the rod that was in my hand. So now I must die?" And Saul answered, "God do so and more also, for you shall surely die, Jonathan." But the people said to Saul, "Shall Jonathan die, who has accomplished this great deliverance in Israel? Certainly not. As the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day." So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. Then Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. Prideful Saul was ready to kill his own son, his firstborn, the heir to the throne, because he had broken an oath, a vow that Jonathan never heard. He was not there when the dad made that vow. In another oath, Saul swore to put Jonathan to death. At that point, all the men came to Jonathan's defense. They prevented this idiot Saul from carrying out his oath and killing his own son. They gave the credit for the victory to this man, Jonathan, with God's help. Jonathan came close to dying for his victory. How would you like to have a dad like that? Ready to kill you just to make a point? The story continues in chapter 18. Now when he, that's David, had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul, and Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David, gave him his armor, even his sword, his bow, and his belt. We are now here right after the battle of David with Goliath. Quite a victory for David. And we have the reaction of Saul. He saw the value of this warrior, and he refused to let him go home anymore to his dad. He wanted him. He wanted his services permanently available at the castle, at where he lived. Then we see the reaction of Jonathan. He loved David as his own soul, verse 1. He loved his neighbor as himself. That's Leviticus 19:18. This type of love is called filial, brotherly love, true friendship. Some people have perverted this verse to mean homosexual love. Not so. There was no homosexual love in here. For a man after God's heart, such love would be an abomination to God. The covenant was made in verse 3. It was a covenant of mutual friendship in which each young man pledged to the other his support and his protection, and also promises to show kindness to each other's descendant. If I die, take care of my kid, and if you die, I'll take care of your kid. That kind of agreement. Jonathan went even further. He gave to David his princely, the robe of a prince, and his weapons to David. And in doing that, Jonathan was sort of transferring to David his position as heir to the throne. I will not be the king. You should be, and you will be. And perhaps Jonathan knew that David was destined to be king. It shows that Jonathan was a generous man. David was a poor man. He was a guy working in a field with the sheep. He had nothing. And Jonathan was generous. He gave to the less fortunate man. And he was not jealous of David taking his place on the throne. He had no animosity towards this man. In the rest of chapter 18, things went downhill for David. The women started to sing their crazy song that Saul killed his 1,000 and David his 10,000. And that's when Saul went nuts. He became jealous of David, and he tried from this moment on to kill him. We saw that story earlier. Chapter 19, now Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted greatly in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, my father Saul seeks to kill you. Therefore, please be on your guard until morning and stay in a secret place and hide. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak with my father about you. Then what I observe, I will tell you. Thus Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his work hath been very good towards you. For he took his life in his hand, and he killed the Philistine, and the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it, and you rejoice. Why then will you sin against innocent blood to kill David without a cause? So Saul heeded the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be killed. Liar. Then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these things. So Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in time past. Saul's mental and spiritual deterioration continued. Saul had said that he would not raise a hand against David in chapter 18. But when his plan to have the Philistine to kill David failed, he promised, I will not kill. His plan was to have the Philistine kill David. He even ordered Jonathan to find David and kill him, here in verse 1. Jonathan immediately warned David about his father's plan and told him to be on his guard. Then Jonathan tried to persuade his father not to hurt David. At least temporarily, Saul came to his senses and he promised that David would not be put to death. Saul will not keep his promise for long. But here, look at Jonathan. This is the guy that we're studying today. Look how he was. He was a peacemaker. He was a reconciler. He went to talk to his dad. He went to talk to his friend. He tried to bring them together, and he did. And he was successful. He brought them together back. He tried real hard to reconcile his dad with David. And it worked for a little while. But Saul was a mental case. He went right back to chasing David and trying to kill him. The story of Jonathan continues in chapter 20. Then David fled to Naioth in Ramah and went and said to Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my iniquity? And what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" So Jonathan said to him, "By no means you shall not die. Indeed, my father will not do anything, either great or small, without first telling me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so." Then David took an oath again and said, "Your father certainly knows that I have found favor in your eyes. And he has said, 'Do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death." So Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you yourself desire, I will do it for you." There's a step between me and death. We can all say that. We are one step. There's one step between you and death. No longer feeling safe, David went to see his best friend Jonathan to find out, why in the world is your dad trying to kill me? What have I done? Have I insulted him? Have I done something terrible? Jonathan knew that his dad had intended to kill David, but he was sure that he had convinced him already that he would not do it. He was sure that his father would never move against David without first confiding in him. But David knew better. Saul was aware that Jonathan and David were best friends. So he did not tell Jonathan that he still planned to kill David. In verses 4 to 9 here, a test was proposed to show if David was in danger or not. Instead of taking his place at the royal table for the new moon feast, David would be absent. If Saul inquired as to his absence, Jonathan was to explain that he had been gone to the yearly sacrifice with his family in Bethlehem. If Saul did not object, then they would all know that David was safe. Don't worry about it. Everything is fine. But if the king became angry because David had once again slipped out of his hand, then Jonathan would know that David was in serious danger. In verses 10 to 23, Jonathan and David made a plan to communicate secretly after Jonathan finds out if David should run or not. Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David to be kind to his family. Jonathan knew David was going to be king. And usually when a person becomes king, he eliminates all the members of the previous king. In verses 24 to 42, at the end of this chapter, sure enough, Saul got very angry when David was missing. He really wanted to kill David. He even got angry with Jonathan, his own son, verse 33. And he threw a spear at his son to kill him. And it came real close. Jonathan was convinced. He warned David, you better run, man. My dad is sicko. He's a mental case. And they hugged, they wept, and they went their separate way. Then chapter 23, Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David in the wood and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Even my father Saul knows that. So the two of them made a covenant before the Lord, and David stayed in the wood, and Jonathan went to his own house. So while David stayed in the wilderness, verse 14, Jonathan went to meet him in the woods. And Jonathan was an encourager. He was a good man. He's trying to encourage David by reminding him that he will be king over Israel, and I'll be right next to you. He was a humble man. He's supposed, by law, if you will, to be the king. He's the firstborn of Saul. He should replace Saul. He said he would be content to just be beside you. That's a simple, humble man and an encourager. Encouraging David, keep on going, don't worry, you're going to be king. Unfortunately, that never happened for the two of them to be together. Jonathan was never next to David when David was king. That was the last time they ever saw each other here. Jonathan was killed in the battle, chapter 31. He died fighting for his country. He died with his two brothers, Abinadab and Malchishua. They died with their father on the field. His dream to stand next to David when he is king never came to pass. As we look in 2 Samuel, David really mourned for his good friend Jonathan. He mourned, he wept, and he fasted until evening. He even wrote a lamentation in verses 17 to 27. And as promised, David provided, he took care of his son Mephibosheth, who was lame. In this case, we see that the son was not at all like the father, because usually like father, like son, not here. That is quite a contrast between Saul, the father, and Jonathan, the son. 6 things were different. Number one, Saul was a prideful man. Jonathan was a humble man. Saul watched things happen. He was sitting most of the time. Jonathan made things happen. Saul trusted his army. Jonathan trusted his God. Saul tried to impress people, so prideful. Jonathan fought without telling people. Saul weakened the army. Jonathan strengthened the army. He was an encourager. And Saul was a talker. He was not a doer. Jonathan was a man of action. What a story. What a life. Jonathan was a great man of God. He was a humble man. He was a faithful man, faithful to God, faithful to his crazy dad, and faithful to his good friend. He was a generous man, even giving to the man who was going to take his job from him. He gave to him. Would you give to the guy who's after your job and is going to take your job? What would you give to him? He gave him everything, his belt, his weapon. He was a good man, generous man. He was a peacemaker. He tried over and over to reconcile his dad to his best friend David. He was an encourager. He encouraged David to keep going. You will be king one day. Hang in there. The church today needs more people like Jonathan. Humble people, faithful people, generous people, peacemakers and encouragers. People who make things happen for the Lord. Yes, it is true that we do not choose the family or the house where we were born. This is decided by the Almighty God. But just because you were born there does not mean that you have to stay there and die there. I left the country, I left the family, I left the language where I was born, and I stayed there. I know I would never have been a pastor for 43 years. I'm glad I made the move. I also know some believers who, with the help of God, were able to influence the entire family. One by one, the entire family was converted to Jesus. The terrible place where they were living became a wonderful Christian place to live. You can do things. Jonathan decided to stay with his best friend David instead of staying with his crazy father. Things would have been totally different for him. He might have been on a run with David for a while, but he would have lived a longer life. He would have lived a better life. He died in his 40s. He could have lived like David in his 70s. And he could accomplish great things for God. But because of his unreasonable father, Jonathan lost his best friend. He lost his freedom and he lost his life. Where God plants you at the beginning of your life does not mean that you have to stay there all your life and die there. Do not blame God for the terrible life you have. Ask Him to guide you to a different place where you can do better for Him and for His kingdom. I have met some people who were miserable where they were. They were totally unfruitful for the Lord. And yet they never bothered to ask God for guidance or direction to relocate them in order to be more profitable and be more fruitful servant for God. Unfortunately, many people today look at relocation strictly for the purpose of advancement, to get a better job, to make more money, to climb up the ladder of success. Being more fruitful for God is never a reason for relocation. And that's the only reason that's acceptable. Next week, we will continue in 1 Samuel and take the story of a girl. Her name is Abigail. She was married to a miser, a cheapskate, and he died. And she married David. Great story. Jonathan did not ask to be born where he was born. He simply arrived there. His dad was a king, but his dad was an unreasonable man, filled with jealousy over the lyrics of one song. And Jonathan could have become just like his dad, but he did not. Sometimes, like father, like son is not true. My dad was a drunk. He was a beater of wife and kids, and I never become like him. there are ways to change. This man changed. He was a good man. Even with an evil dad, we don't know anything about his mom. His mom might have been a nice lady who helped him to remain the way he is. But it's very important that we learn from this man. We need to be generous people. God is generous with us. We need to be generous people. We need to be reconciler. The not talking to someone for years is unacceptable for Christian. Change your name. Remove the name of Christ in your name because you're insulting God. Be a reconciler. We are asking the Bible to be a reconciler and to be encouragers. Everybody is struggling. They're having problems. Life is difficult. It's $12 for a dozen of eggs. We need encouragement. Be encouragers. May the Lord bless each and every one of you. May He bless your life, bless your new year, bless your home, your family, and may He touch your heart today. May He change a few things in your heart, and may you be encouragers, and may you be generous, and may you be reconciler. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.